Good afternoon. So normally I do this talk on Tuesdays. It is Wednesday, but I had electricians in my house working on my house yesterday. So y'all get this. There was a short yesterday explaining that we would be talking about codependency and addiction today. And we're going to be talking about the codependency myth. For those of you who are wondering if I did the short on Jesus in the workplace, it's still there. Just go back. It got posted earlier than this one did today. So you can look at that as well. But the codependency myth is this. That's that a person becomes addicted, they become an addict, and then their family member or significant other becomes codependent because of their addiction. Now, that's what people think. And unless it was a sentinel event in your whole family line, this is probably not really the case. So for some people that nobody in their family ever struggled with addiction, and there was something like they went to war, maybe in, World War II or World War I or Afghanistan or Korea or Vietnam or Panama or, I don't even know where all the places that we've had since I was alive. Bosnia, and Serbia and Herzegovina, whatever, that I can't even pronounce the word. But all of these people may have had a sentinel event where nobody in the family before them had an issue with substance abuse. And that's a very good possibility. But the reality for most of us, for an overwhelming majority of us, is that someone else in our family probably had a problem with addiction of some sort before we did. So, what kind of addictions could there be? Well, there could be alcohol or substance abuse or food or, I'm trying to read these, what I wrote here, hoarding or gambling or pornography. There's also cutting and food disorders, not just eating too much food, but eating not enough food. And so all kinds of addictions that we don't need to name every single addiction today, but these are all just symptoms of addiction. And they can all look different, but they're still all addictions. Even somebody who sits around and binge watches on TV, and that could be their addiction, right? But what about the codependents? What are their symptoms? What is a symptom of codependency? Do you know? Well, we'll talk about that later. But for right now, we're going to look at the family of someone who's in addiction. So the person who is in addiction, they had maybe brothers and sisters, and maybe one of them became addicted to something as well, maybe the other one did not. And then they had a parent who was probably addicted. And on both sides of their family tree, there are probably people who have addiction. And the reason that is because whether it's tobacco or being a workaholic or, maybe it's even over-the-counter medications, these things all happened in the family before generations before it got to you or before it got to your child or your spouse. So if you look back in the family trees, usually all of the family trees has something to do with some kind of addiction, whether it's a workaholism, alcoholism, gambling, something. And in that family tree, there was a person who was addicted, and then there was a person who was codependent with the person who was addicted. Now, all of these little dotted lines show how each of the family members of the person who was addicted, they all learned codependency. So it continues down the line, and a codependent and an addict marry each other maybe before they recognize their codependency or their addiction. And then their children in turn learn codependency before any of them become addicted. This is very significant and very important to understand because a lot of people feel like my whole family's codependent because I'm an addict. It's all my fault. I'm the one that's completely screwed up everyone. And the reality is that's not true. because each person in these family trees learned to be codependent. I put little blue lines around all of them. They all learned to be codependent before they became addicted. Now, at some point, there may have been that sentinel event where somebody became addicted to something, maybe because of PTSD during one of the Great Wars, and their family members had to learn how to cope. And in that generation, people didn't get divorced. So it was basically the idea that you had to learn how to cope with whatever that person had gone through in war. Now people get divorced. They say, well, I'm just not putting up with that. I'm not dealing with that. And they separate. In the generations of the Great Wars, people did not separate. So the families really did learn to be codependent with the person who had become addicted to painkillers, or maybe they got addicted to gambling, maybe it was alcohol, it may have been cigarettes, and they became addicted in order to cover up a trauma that they had had in their life. Now, a trauma doesn't have to be from war. It could be from a suicide, a rape, experiencing something like one of the great earthquakes, or having a family member who suffers a severe illness and the fallout from that illness, or losing a family member due to an illness that happened like in 1918 when we had the great flu epidemic. So all of these things can cause a sentinel event, means the starting event. And in those generations in particular, people did stay together, so they learned to be codependent when that sentinel event happened. And some of you might say, well, there's no sentinel event in my family, and there's nobody that had any addictions. My family didn't have any addictions, so how do you think that I became codependent? That's a good question, right? Well, the answer that I usually say to people is, so tell me, is there anyone in your family who's a workaholic? Oh, they usually say yes. Well, you know, my dad was a workaholic, and I mean, we hardly ever even saw him unless we went to go work. He had his own business, and his grandfather was a traveling businessman, and he was gone all the time, and we hardly ever saw him either. So you see, there's two generations then of workaholics. It tells me that somewhere back in the family tree that may not have been talked about, there may have been a secret addiction somewhere, because everyone learned how to have an addiction or learned how to be codependent. So generally, people learn how to be codependent before they become an addict. And this is very significant to understand, because codependency is a learned behavior. It's a learned behavior. It's not something that just all of a sudden happens to you. You learn it over time. So, if codependency is a learned behavior, what are you learning to do? You are learning to cover up for or to blame the person with the addiction problem. So we might cover up for dad being a workaholic. Well, you know, he just works so hard. Or we might cover up for the person who has a problem with alcohol or substance abuse. Oh, you know, they were just really tired after work. We don't want to say, well, they were passed out on the couch. So they were just really tired. They worked really hard, or they had, you know, a bad thing happen this week and he just can't face anybody today. So we make all kinds of excuses for them, right? This is how we learn to be codependent. And we also have to do other things. Some people might have grown up with a family member who had alcohol or substance abuse, or maybe they abused over-the-counter prescriptions. And then what did the children do? Maybe even as young as 3 or 5 years old, they had to figure out how to make their own food, get themselves to the bus on time for school. So these are things that children often learn very early in life, how to cover up for their family members who suffer from addictions. But here's the surprise. In the codependent family system, the codependent is actually addicted to someone else's addiction. Okay, let me just pull this back up again. So remember how we talked about that they learn, codependent learns to be codependent from their family? So you learn that there's this person has drama, and the drama is related to whatever they're addicted to. And whatever that looks like, whether it's workaholic or it could be pornography, where you just see them kind of like check out in the middle of a room. They're no longer there with you anymore. And you can see that their eyes are there, but they're not connecting with anybody in the room. They're watching some kind of a video in their head. They have disconnected from their family. And so the codependent either learns to emotionally guard themselves and be prepared for whenever that person comes back, and what they're going to be like when they are in their addiction, what they're like when they're not in their addiction. It's kind of like having divorced parents, but you're living in the same house with someone. You never know which parent is actually going to be living with you when you get home that day. So you end up becoming addicted to the drama that is created by their addiction. You end up being addicted to worrying. You end up being addicted to anxiety, and you end up being addicted to depression. And that sounds kind of weird, but if you're used to having depression or anxiety or worry or fear, or maybe you just shut down. You know, that's another thing that people do sometimes. But also, the codependent is also addicted to someone else's drama. And so, many of you may have known someone who, when they get drunk, they are responding really poorly. Maybe they're an overly happy drunk and they hug everybody and they crack jokes, and maybe they're not appropriate jokes. Or maybe they're a negative person and they really are angry, and so you're addicted to the drama that they create in the room. They're always creating a scene, and that takes the attention off of you, and you have a measure of entertainment from it. So you can be addicted to the drama and the entertainment that they bring. But these are the codependent symptoms. They either have anxiety, depression, or fear, and that's because they don't really necessarily always know how to deal with it, and they're afraid of the surprise, or they're afraid of the consequences, or they feel like they're out of control and they don't know how to gain control. So they end up doing this in their own body. They worry, they do all kinds of things like that. But there's another kind of codependent that's even sneakier to discover and to know what they are doing. And that's the one that's hyper in control. They're very stoic. They're always in control. No emotion. Let me just shut my face down. I heard you. I know what you're saying. You see, they're just like, I'm not going to respond emotionally. I am not going to engage emotionally. They dissociate emotionally. And they just choose to shut down because there is so much drama with the person who has the addiction that they just say, you know, I can't have that much drama in my life, so I'm going to shut down. My way of dealing with your drama is to pretend like the drama doesn't exist. And I'm not going to share any of my emotions with you because I don't want you to see that I actually responded. So I'm going to unrespond you. I'm kind of like unfriending you. I'm unfriending you with my emotions. And so these are some of the things that codependents will do. And it's very common that people say, oh, well, you know, nobody in my family has any kind of anxiety or anything. And I say, really? So tell me about them. They'll usually say, oh, my grandmother, she didn't have any anxiety or depression. In fact, she was always in charge. In fact, she didn't even show any emotion. She might have gotten angry a few times. Well, actually not really very many. She just disciplined all of us. And she ruled with an iron rod. Well, she was in this section here. She was the one who is hyper in control, and she was dissociating emotionally from family members. She was not having healthy relationships with other people because she was protecting herself. These are protective types of devices that people who are codependent have. And you all learned early in life, you all learned to be protective of yourself in some way. You all learned to be protective of the person who is an addict in some way. You learned how to be codependent before you became addicted to something. And this is so significant to understand because you need to understand that you are not the only one in the family who's been affected. You were affected by things in your past, just like they were affected by things in their past, and you're not alone. You are not alone, and you're not the only one who's at fault. So it's super important that you understand this so that you can heal, because thinking that it's all your fault makes you feel so guilty. Go back and listen to my first video. It's on guilt and shame and how to get rid of that, how to live an anchorless life. That's really important, because all of these things in codependency and addiction heap loads and loads of guilt and shame on us, and we need to start letting go of those things. So if you want to learn more, please subscribe to my channel, and I constantly am going to be doing these videos, something a little new every week on either addiction or codependency. And on Wednesdays, I always do a little short on Jesus in the workplace, because those of you who have had consequences because of your addiction, maybe you've had a arrest that's resulted in something on your record that will prevent you from getting a security clearance. So if you've had a felony on your record, you're not going to get a security clearance. But guess what? You can still start a business, and you can still have employees. You don't need to be the only business, and it doesn't need to just be mowing somebody's lawns, and you don't have only the option of working at McDonald's or on a garbage truck. You can actually start your own business, and you can be successful. You can overcome. So I just want to encourage you all, and that's why we have Wednesdays with Jesus in the workplace, because you can succeed. And so go ahead and subscribe. You can follow me on Noom Counseling on Instagram and Facebook, and call me at 305-832-1743 if you want to set up an appointment and work through this more one-on-one. So have a great day. I hope you're all going to succeed today in whatever you do. And please, please, please watch that first video if you're struggling with guilt or shame. Have a great day. Bye-bye.